Lismore knows floods, but this is more devastating than ever. Young, old and furry, they're all being desperately ferried to safety, but with almost 1,000 calls for assistance in 24 hours, people need help quicker than it can arrive.
The water's still rising. My dog is stuck inside my house, and it's an emergency.
Hello, I'm Paul Barry. Welcome to Media Watch. And in 2020, it was bushfires like we'd never seen before. In 2022, it is floods, among the worst in living memory. 22 people have lost their lives and many have lost everything they owned. Meanwhile, rubbish is piled up on the streets, thousands have no shelter, and the damage bill will be counted in billions. So, just how bad was the disaster? The media were playing pick a number.
This flood is now set to be the worst flood in 50 years in Lismore.
This is probably that 1 in 100 year flood we've been warned about.
I'm advised it's a 1 in 500 year flood.
This is a 1 in a 1,000 year event. This event is unprecedented.
It's a 1 in 3,500 year event.
Yes, nearly back to Noah's Ark. And in the last 2 weeks, the news here has been full of dramatic rescues, but also of mounting anger that state and local governments and the army have not done more.
We need emergency housing now. Where are the mobile homes? We need them now. There are people not able to shower. There are people not able to go home. Their homes are gone. Where is the New South Wales Planning Minister? This is a planning disaster.
So, when the Prime Minister, who was in COVID isolation for a week, made it to Lismore last Wednesday, he knew he'd be in for a rough time. Which is no doubt one reason why the media was not invited to tag along on his chats to locals. The PM's explanation later was,
In disasters like this, not everybody wants a camera shoved in their face while they're trying to share their heart with you.
But with emotions running high, the PM was also no doubt trying to avoid a repeat of his unfortunate attempts to press the flesh in the 2020 bushfires.
I'm only shaking your hand if you give more funding to our RFS.
Oh, no, you're really going to check. Oh, well, it's nice to see you.
You won't be getting any votes down here, buddy. You're an idiot. You're out, son. You are out. Go on, get to Kirribilli. We might burn that down. Scummer! Scummer!
So, did the PM's ploy work? Not really. The commercial bulletins that night re-ran the bushfire footage anyway, and bookended it with the PM's press conference, which he couldn't avoid, where he faced a barrage of hostile questions on the community's behalf.
They feel like they've been abandoned by government, state government, federal government. Do you understand why they feel that way?
Do you believe that the federal government owes the people of Lismore an apology for this?
As I said,
where are people going to live? So we've got thousands of people, most of whom do not have flood insurance.
Yep.
They're saying $1,000 barely gets them a bed back.
Inevitably, the PM was also asked whether climate change was making these disasters worse, or, as the latest report from the IPCC last month found, more frequent, intense and extreme. And for once, he did not try to dodge the question.
So obviously climate change is having an impact here in Australia, as it is in every country around the world.
And in case it wasn't clear what he meant, Mr Morrison explained,
We are dealing with a different climate to the one we were dealing with before. I think that's just an obvious fact. And Australia is getting hard to live in because of these disasters.
So, was his blunt acceptance of the risks of climate change welcomed by the apologists at News Corp, who supposedly saw the light last year with this announcement?
Climate of change.
Mission Zero.
Sadly not. As South East Queensland and Northern New South Wales drowned in mud, the Australian's Chris Kenny had told readers,
They are not new. Floods, droughts, fires, heat waves and storms have always been with us and always will be, especially in this land of droughts and flooding rains.
And after the PM's press conference 5 days later, Kenny was saying it again on Sky.
This isn't new. We've always had them. We will always have them.
And regular commentator Liz Storer, who's on a mission to stamp out militant climate activism, was loudly in agreement.
Well, we do nothing. We do nothing then. Like these floods, these fires are new, Chris. They have always been synonymous with living in Australia. This is nothing new for Australia.
It certainly is not.
It's nothing new.
Certainly is not. Granted that at Lismore, they say it's a record flood since European settlement. That was a record. But you're always going to get some records generally.
Yes, they're only records after all, which means they are the worst floods ever in Lismore. Meanwhile, on the same channel, 90 minutes later, Andrew Bolt was also busy dissing the link.
Let me now go back to this claim that we now read everywhere. This incredible rain these record floods obviously caused by global warming. So, what is the truth? Has global warming actually made these floods worse?
Answer, no, according to Bolt and his guest William Kinnamonth, a long-time climate sceptic. And other Sky News hosts and guests had also been denying the connection between climate change and extreme weather events, just as they did when the bushfires struck 2 years ago.
Well, now we've got the climate change warriors using these disasters to blame a warming planet and CO2 emissions. Horrible timing. And yet the greenest of scientists maintain you simply cannot link climate change to individual disasters.
We've always had these bushfires, we've always had flooding, and to blame it on climate change, CO2, Nicholas, is a load of bloody BS.
Every time there's a natural disaster, we then link it back to climate change. We just link one thing with another without any kind of logical framework or proper science.
But some Sky hosts went even further than that, saying climate change was not to blame for the floods, but climate activists were.
We're suffering these floods all up and down the East Coast, not because of climate change, even though the Queensland Premier has said it's climate change, you know. It's actually because of deliberate green inertia. And it's all because of these militant Greens.
Who, says Gary Hargrave, have stopped Australia building dams for flood control. And in News Corp's Courier Mail, another Sky pundit was echoing that claim.
If ever we needed proof that Labor Greens' lunacy is hurting Australia, take a look at the southeast Queensland floods.
But on Sky's Outsiders, Rowan Dean was going even further than that, claiming it's not just the floods you can blame on climate activists, it's the war in Ukraine as well.
If you destroy your cheap, affordable energy, you not only disarm yourself, you invite aggression from those who have not destroyed their own energy supplies.
And on yesterday's Outsiders, co-host James Morrow dialed it up to 11.
The West has deliberately weakened itself with green ideology for the past 20, 30 years since the Cold War. And, you know, you have to say that the Greta Thunbergs of the world are just as responsible for this conflict as anybody else.
Well, I think more responsible.
And in the News Corp papers, others, like Andrew Bolt, were making similar accusations.
Here come the vultures again. Green journalists are exploiting these floods to push the global warming scam that makes us so weak and Russia and China strong.
As was Matt Canavan in The Australian.
This deluded agenda, championed by a Swedish teenager, has weakened the industrial strength of the free world, and that has only encouraged bullies like Putin.
And Miranda Devine in the Daily Telly.
No wonder Putin regards the West as so decadent and weak that he could stroll into Ukraine with impunity.
It is amazing, isn't it? Whether it's floods, bushfires, invasions or war crimes, this mob can spin anything into a culture war. There may well be some truth in what they say. Australia is a land of fire and flood. Building more dams might help in flood control, and reliance on Russian gas has made it harder for Europe to punish Putin's aggression. But to blame floods and war on those who want to reduce global warming is not just ridiculous, it's a cynical perversion of the truth, and not for the first time. But now, to the alternative Prime Minister and a dramatic declaration.
Opposition leader Anthony Albanese is pitching to govern in the style of Bob Hawke and John Howard.
Yes, you heard right. A Labor Party leader wants to emulate a Liberal Party legend. And that revelation came from Anthony Albanese himself, with the Australian nabbing a preview of his speech last week and splashing it on page 1.
I'll be more like a Hawke or a Howard. Albanese. The opposition leader will say that he is seeking to reform the economy in the same fashion as former Liberal Prime Minister John Howard and Labor Prime Minister Bob Hawke.
And that front page certainly got the commentariat buzzing.
He even mentions John Howard. Whenever Labor leaders mention John Howard, remember Kevin Rudd tried to be kind of John Howard light before he won in 2007. So where's the sign that Labor's smelling victory?
Saying you're going to be like John Howard, I think there'd be a few Labor luminaries turning over in their grave at that thought.
And you can imagine how it went down among the Coalition's cheer squad in the media, like The Spectator magazine.
On behalf of all Australians, allow us to tell opposition leader Anthony Albanese, Albo, you are no Bob Hawke and you are certainly no John Howard.
And, of course, Sky News.
I had to do a double take today. Albanese, the darling of Labor's very left wing for life, trying to compare himself to John Howard?
That was what was so insulting about Albanese trying to compare himself to someone like John Howard, because he doesn't have that same level of conviction.
No conviction and no self-confidence, as John Howard himself pointed out the very next day.
Howard to Elbow.
Don't try to ride on my coattails. John Howard has described Anthony Albanese's attempt to identify with his record on reform as evidence of the Labor leader's lack of confidence in himself.
So, 2 front-page stories in The Australian in 2 days on the opposition leader's libwash. And the pile-on to Albanese didn't end there, with the Daily Telegraph chiming in.
Each way Elbow flipped views on leaders.
Which pointed out that Albo had attacked Howard in the past, but was now singing his praises. So, what did Albanese actually say in that speech? Well, he certainly evoked former Labor leaders.
I'll take my lead from Bob Hawke and his successor, Paul Keating.
But how many times did John Howard's name score a mention? In fact, not once. That is, 0. And you have to listen closely to detect any reference at all.
A former Liberal Prime Minister once said that in the race for economic reform, you would never reach the finish line because it was always advancing and there would always be something else to do to make our economy stronger and more productive. I didn't always agree with him, but I agree with him on that.
The former Liberal leader being you-know-who. So how, in the hands of The Australian, did that passing nod to ongoing economic reform turn into this front-page splash? Was The Australian just taking a liberty and beating up the story? It seems the answer is no. We asked the paper to justify its reporting, and Editor-in-Chief Chris Daw told us.
Albo's office contacted our political editor before publication to point out the reference to Howard in the speech, in an attempt clearly to get us to highlight the reference he was making. He clearly attempted to suggest he shared Howard's approach to reform.
Well, fancy that. The dark arts of media management laid bare. How better to rebrand a lifelong lefty than to have the media sizing him up against a Liberal Party legend. And no fingerprints to give you away. But is it true? Having approached Albanese's office multiple times for comment, we finally got a call from the man himself, who said he had certainly not called The Australian. We then asked him and his office to confirm or deny that a call had been made, but we did not hear back. And finally, to the consumer story of the Times.
Ashley Wick is in Adelaide for us this morning. Ashley, just how high will prices get?
Ashley, good morning. How bad's it going to get? Ashley, good morning. Just how high are we talking?
Sky high, it seems. And when it comes to petrol pain at the Bowser, the media have one go-to commentator.
Joining me now is Peter Khoury from the NRMA. Morning to you.
To discuss this, we're joined by Peter Khoury from the NRMA in Sydney.
Well, Peter Khoury is with the NRMA.
Peter Khoury joins us now in Sydney. Peter Khoury.
Peter, always nice to talk to you.
Peter, good afternoon to you. What are we looking at here in terms of petrol prices?
How high can they go, Pete?
Peter, how much further can we expect these prices to rise?
It is tireless work, and rain, hail or shine, Khoury fronts up to the cameras. And if he's not doing live crosses, then he's pumping it out for the evening news.
These prices are completely off the scale, more than twice what they were paying in April 2020. It is absolutely critical that people go and fill up now.
According to Isentia, Peter's notched up more than 200 mentions across TV and radio since the start of the year, and 40 of those are in the last week. And while we think Peter's doing a terrific job, surely the national media could lighten his load and find some other commentators to discuss oil prices. After all, this story is not going away. And to show you how fast prices have moved, here's you-know-who speaking to Koshi 6 weeks ago.
Peter, there are suggestions that petrol could hit $2, even $3 a litre. Is that likely to play out?
Oh, goodness, no. Hopefully not.
And here's Peter last week as we started hitting that $2 mark.
OK, what are petrol prices going to get to in Australia?
We have no idea where we would set the ceiling at this point.
And we can thank the Russians for that, or maybe those climate activists. That's all from us tonight. There's more on our website where you can stream or download the programme and read the full statement from The Australian. And don't forget Media Bites every Thursday. But for now, until next week, goodbye.